ARCS is finally here, and if you're like me, you have been obsessed with it like no other game. Both the base game and the campaign game have completely taken over my life, and as such, I have just been playing and thinking about nothing but pretty much ARCS. The campaign game especially, I think everybody agrees, is one of the most interesting story and narrative generators that you can play in a game. And because of that heavy narrative element, something that I have been thinking a lot about is the kinds of stories and books that give me the same vibe and same feel as the ARCS campaign. And I've seen some people in the Leader Discord kind of asking about book recommendations for things that give you the same feeling as ARCS, and I thought that would be a great kind of unconventional, unorthodox video than the kind of the stuff that I normally do today. But that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to give you guys my sci-fi book recommendations that give you some kind of ARCS vibes in some way. All right, we're going to start off the list here with an honorable mention. Not that this is like a ranked list. I say it's an honorable mention because I know that these books were direct influences on the campaign version of ARCS, specifically because of comments that Cole Worley himself has made in podcasts. And these are books that I've actually bought specifically to read in preparation for ARCS to get in that headspace. And unfortunately, I just didn't quite have the time to read them. Well, I did, but I got distracted by a bunch of other books, which is normally what happens to me. So the books that I'm talking about are Hyperion by Dan Simmons and the Mars Trilogy by Kim Stanley Robinson. So again, I actually can't comment on the quality of these books. I only know that these are well reviewed and highly regarded, and that Cole specifically cited them as influences on ARCS. I just haven't read them yet. So I bought them. I meant to read them. Honestly, I actually meant to read these books in preparation for my campaign review, and that just got so delayed for other things that I didn't have the time to read these. But if you're looking for books that Cole has specifically mentioned as inspirations, then I think starting with Hyperion or Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars Trilogy is probably a safe bet. I've read the backs of these books, the summaries, they seem like really cool books, and I plan on getting to them one day, but I just haven't yet because I've been distracted. All right, so let's get into my actual list. These are books that I have read and I can actually talk about, and I kind of picked these not because everything in the book reminds me completely of ARCS. Some of these books I picked just because of one little element I think reminds me of a specific fate or a specific mechanic, and that's why I included it in the list. All right, so we're going to start with the first recommendation, and that is To Sleep in a Sea of Stars by Christopher Paolini. So this is the author of the Aragon series. So I don't know if you guys grew up reading the Inheritance cycle like I did, but To Sleep in a Sea of Stars is Christopher Paolini's epic sci-fi universe, and it started with this book. The reason I'm starting with this one first is because I think it was a pretty good book, but it's not my favorite of this list. The reason I picked it is there are some elements of the story that do have some ARCS vibes. Oh, my puppy's coming up. Hey, buddy. Come on up here. Come on. You want to send the video? Yeah, here you go. Here you go. This is the reason why the campaign review video was delayed by like 2 months, because we had to train this bad boy right here. Okay, so back to Sleep in a Sea of Stars. So this is probably, out of all the books on the list, this is probably my least favorite. And I know this is going to sound like I think it's bad. I don't think it's bad. This is a giant, this is a chonky book. It's like 600 pages. It is a hard sci-fi. So one of the reasons this doesn't completely give me ARCS vibes is that ARCS in my mind is a sci-fi kind of retro fantasy kind of feel. And To Sleep in a Sea of Stars is much more hard sci-fi than ARCS is. However, there's one story element in here that reminds me of some of the fates in ARCS, specifically the Caretaker fate. So in the Caretaker fate, something that's interesting is that, I don't know if this is technically a spoiler. This is just kind of like the synopsis, but basically humans come in contact with an alien thing in the beginning of the book, and it's kind of like this alien artifact, and it really reminds me thematically of the Caretaker fate with the golems. So in Campaign ARCS, the Caretaker has to go around and find these like ancient alien artifacts, and they end up waking up, and you can use them to do cool things. And then later in Act 2, those things actually can go haywire and turn against you. And so if you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. This alien artifact that becomes the major plot point for the main character really reminds me of that idea. And the second thing that gives me ARCS vibes in this book is there's a second alien race that is such a unique, wacky description of how an alien race works. And it reminds me of the kind of wacky aliens and creatures that Kyle Farron would draw for ARCS. So these kinds of like weird octopus, tentacle, ball, alien monsters. There's some really, really interesting, weird sci-fi alien races in this book. And so those are the two elements of this book that I think give me some ARCS vibes. If you want a book that's in this universe that I liked more, his kind of prequel spinoff short story Fractal Noise, I actually enjoyed a lot more than this book overall. However, that book just doesn't really have any ARCS vibes, which is why it's not on the list. So again, pick this up if you want something with some, elements of ARCS in here. If you want, I think, a better book, Fractal Noise, I think, is a better, more character-focused book than To Sleep in a Sea of Stars. All right, next up, I may not have gotten to read Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy yet. I'm really excited. Hopefully I can start the next year. However, I did end up reading Kim Stanley Robinson's Aurora, which is another book that Cole directly referenced. I can't remember in which podcast. It might have been the Space Biff podcast. The reason this is going to remind you of ARCS is for one simple reason. Aurora takes place on a generational ship. So this giant ship has launched from Earth and is on a hundreds of years voyage to colonize another planet in another solar system. And the entire book takes place on this generation ship, and you're like, I think 2 generations into this journey. So you pick up the book 2 generations into this journey. This ship has been, sailing towards the planet Aurora for, I think, over 200 years at this point. And the reason, obviously, if you play campaign ARCS, this is very reminiscent of the flagship mechanic, specifically in the campaign. So in the ARCS campaign, 4 of the B fates pivot you to a flagship faction. And a flagship faction sees you take all of your civilization and put them on one giant ship, and all the buildings and starports that you build are built onto the ship. And the idea is that all of your character and all of their peoples are just on one ship roving around. And it's very reminiscent of Aurora, this idea of what is it actually like to be on one giant ship. Now, again, this isn't really sci-fi fantasy. This is much more hard sci-fi. If you're really interested in, hey, mechanically, what would it actually look like if you wanted to live for hundreds of years on one spaceship? What would it look like to maintain that? What would society look like developed? How would it develop if you're raised and born in a spaceship? What would that be like? What would happen when you finally reach your destination? How would that affect things? There's a lot of really cool sci-fi, hard sci-fi concepts in here. The world building on the generation ship is really cool. I really liked the characters in this, and the framing device, which lends to the unorthodox writing style in this book, was also very fascinating to me. The book is written from the viewpoint of the main computer ship AI that is running a lot of the ship, and it is tasked with chronicling what happens on the ship. And there's some really interesting things that Kim Stanley Robinson does with that framing device. It's not just a framing device. It is written as if a computer is writing it and trying to figure out what storytelling even means, and how would you even chronicle a story? What's important? What do you leave out? Obviously, ARCS the flagship isn't really dealing with those kinds of things for the most part, but this is a really fascinating book. I really enjoyed reading it, and by the end, I was really emotionally moved by the things that happened in it. So, Kim Stanley Robinson's Aurora, this is a really good book if you want a little bit of, you want to read about a flagship, basically. All right, so I'm going to pivot now more into some of the science fiction fantasy series, because I think that's where you're going to get more of the kinds of stories that ARCS is going to tell. You can't really talk about science fiction fantasy without at least getting into a little bit of some Star Wars. So truthfully, I'm not as big of a Star Wars fan as I once was, and I don't read a lot of Star Wars books. However, I think you'd be an idiot not to read some Star Wars books that center around the character of Grand Admiral Thrawn. I think obviously you guys can see where I'm going with this, where the inspiration comes, where the ARCS vibes comes from. But basically, if you played the Admiral fate in the campaign, you're like, man, I really liked this Admiral character, and there's a lot of interesting stories that I could tell with this, or I'm really into military sci-fi, then you can't go wrong with some Thrawn stories from the Star Wars universe. Thrawn is, maybe one of the most interesting characters in the Star Wars universe. And specifically, the reason I know some people, if there's a Star Wars fan in this video, they're going to see me hold up this version, and they're going to be like, bro, why didn't you hold up Heir to the Empire, the original Thrawn trilogy? And I'm going to explain that. So if you're looking for a good Thrawn story that I think goes more along the lines of the kinds of stories you can tell with the Admiral fate in ARCS, the new Timothy Zahn book set in the Disney era, I actually enjoy more because in Thrawn's TV appearances, both in Rebels and Ahsoka, and in the original Heir to the Empire trilogy, Thrawn is more, in my opinion, of a I don't want to say cartoonish, because he wasn't like completely cartoonish, but he is a little more of a cartoonishly evil person in those original 3. What I like about Thrawn in the new books is that he comes off as more of an anti-hero, which I find much more interesting. He's a little bit more relatable, and I think he's a lot more complex in these books than his characterization as just a straight villain in the original trilogy. That original trilogy with Heir to the Empire is good, and it has some good Thrawn moments, but the other thing is that Thrawn is a main character in these new books, which is why I'm picking these. But what I like about this is obviously the Admiral inspiration is clear. Thrawn is such an interesting Admiral character. He's kind of got like Sherlockian vibes because he's very smart, he's very calculating. He's the kind of guy that can look at a piece of art from his enemy's culture and then determine their military tactics just from looking at the painting. Some really, really cool moments here. He's such a cool character. And I wanted to pick this because I think when you look at the Admiral fate in ARCS, you're like, oh, this guy is a villain. But I think the Admiral can either be a hero or a villain. And I think especially in this book, or in this trilogy, Thrawn, and in his prequel trilogy, Thrawn kind of fits both of those. He can be like a hero, anti-hero, or a villain. He kind of flip-flops between the two. And so he's a much more interesting character, and he's a lot more nuanced in that sense. And I think that can show you that, hey, this Admiral character that I'm playing, he's not necessarily a tyrant, which is kind of the vibe you get when you play with his fates and his cards. You think, oh, he's some tyrannical military leader for the Empire. But maybe he is actually trying to look out for the Reach. Maybe he is trying to just protect the Empire from the Blight. And I think in that sense, Thrawn will give you a lot of vibes of that kind of storytelling that the Admiral fate can get you in ARCS. And he's just an entertaining character to read about. Next up, this is a book series that literally just started this year. So it's not finished. So I could recommend this to you, and then we get to the end of this trilogy, and maybe it's a total crapshoot, I don't know. But I'm also only recommending this for a very niche reason. And so the book that I'm recommending here is The Mercy of the Gods, which is the first book in the Captives War trilogy by James S.A. Corey. So James S.A. Corey is the pen name for a pair of authors, Ty Frank and Daniel Abraham. And they wrote a series that we will definitely be talking about later in the video. And this is their new series, The Captives War. So what is The Captives War? All right, so it's the story about these humans who have lived on this alien planet for hundreds of years. They don't know how they got there. And the book opens with a bunch of scientist main characters as their planet is invaded by an alien empire. The scientists are taken captive, and then they're given instructions on how to survive and how to be of use to this new alien empire. This is another it's like a mix between hard sci-fi and fantasy sci-fi, because some of the aliens races that are described in this book are so wacky and out there and alien. They're very fantastical because you don't know what they are or how they operate. However, it's also very hard sci-fi in that a group of scientists are the main character and they talk about sciencey stuff all the time. So why am I recommending this series, this trilogy, even though it's not finished? For one really funny niche reason, the main alien race described in The Mercy of the Gods, in my head, when it was described, all I could think about was the art that Kyle Farron drew for the Magnate Fate. I know this is such a weird reason to recommend a book, but the main alien race called the ARCS, they sound literally exactly like the way the Magnate Fate is drawn in campaign ARCS. And in my head, anytime a ARCS alien showed up, all I could think about was that giant centipede-looking alien. I think they're kind of described as more ant-like than what the Magnate Fate art looks like, but all I could picture was the Magnate Fate art. The book was also really good. James S.A. Corey just has a way of getting you attached to characters so quickly and so efficiently that I am just surprised. I know a lot of people who read this book liked it more for the sci-fi concepts and the world building, and all that stuff is cool, and they kind of discounted the characters in this book. And I just disagree. I think James S.A. Corey has always done what has drawn me to their series the most has always been the characters, first and foremost. The world building is cool, the sci-fi stuff is cool, love the concepts, but it's always grounded in some of the best characters you can read about. And the way they get you attached to these scientist characters so quickly and so efficiently, to the point that when bad things happen to them, you are really emotionally invested, is just really impressive. So it's also a short book. It's only like 400 pages, and the text isn't that big. I mean, you can see, I read this book in 2 days. I devoured it. I can't wait for the rest of the trilogy. James S.A. Corey is one of my favorite authors, since it's 2 of them. And it's not hard to see why when you read this book. So the next book up is the book that got me into sci-fi. It made me a sci-fi fan. I read it when I was 12, I think, and it has stuck with me ever since, and it's kind of always been one of the high bars that I judge books from, and that is the sci-fi classic Ender's Game. So the reason I'm recommending Ender's Game, not just because it's an incredible book, but specifically because the conflict in this book reminds me a lot of the Empire versus the Blight conflict that is the setup for campaign arcs. So in campaign arcs, you have this empire that has been, in my opinion, has used to control the entire reach, but has been pushed back to just a small corner of the galaxy because this blight has risen up. I know that that's the lore in my mind. I don't know if that's been disputed or not. I don't know if the blight are supposed to be the natives. It doesn't really matter. The point is that Ender's Game picks up, and humanity is losing this war against this alien race of bug-like creatures. And I don't really want to spoil it because it's just, I think you should go in blind because it's such a great book. And the characters and the story and what you learn, like the way it explores human nature and the military sci-fi and training aspects of it they were very impactful. This book emotionally impacted me and really changed the way I viewed the world, even at just the young age of 12 and 13. I read this book multiple times. I watched the movie multiple times. The movie is obviously not as good as the book because basically the movie takes the book and goes, oh, this book is about a young kid. Well, this must be a YA book. And they kind of made it into a YA dystopian movie, which is not what Ender's Game is at all. It's a very deep, mature book, and it explores a lot of really heavy themes. And the ending of this book, man, it's really powerful. And the stuff that they do at the end of this book will stick with you for a long while. And that's why I'm recommending Ender's Game. It's a classic for a reason. It's just so good. If you've asked anybody in the last 10 years, just a regular person on the side of the street, what their favorite sci-fi book is, if you look on any booktube channels that recommend sci-fi series, it would probably be pretty difficult for you not to find somebody who recommends the Red Rising saga. And I'm a latecomer to the Red Rising saga. I only read it this year. I started it a couple months ago, and I read all 6 books within maybe a month, 2 months. And the last book in the saga is probably coming out next year, hopefully the next 2 years. And from book 2 onwards, so from Golden Sun to Lightbringer, the series is an absolute blast. It is such a fun series. Red Rising, I get the hype. I buy into the hype now. I love Red Rising. I get it. I know a lot of people disagree with me about the first book. My immediate friends who recommended me the series, I told them I didn't like the first book and they didn't get it. But from book 2 onward, the series is an absolute blast. It's such a great modern sci-fi series. Pierce Brown writes this really interesting first-person, present-tense prose writing style that it's hard to describe, and it feels weird when you're first reading it, but man, it's so cool and it's so interesting. And what it leads to is a really fast-paced, action-packed series. What's interesting about Red Rising is it started out as an original trilogy. Red Rising, Golden Sun, Morning Star. And that was supposed to be the end of the trilogy, end of the series. But then Pierce Brown continued the series a couple years later, starting with Iron Gold, and then Dark Age, and now Lightbringer, and he's going to end it up soon. Instead of just seeing everything from Darrow's point of view, Brown makes a really smart choice, in my opinion, to introduce more POV chapters. Still written in the first person, present tense style. And what I love about it is you can liken the original trilogy of Red Rising to the base game of ARCS. It's fast, it's snappy, it's a blast, it's action-packed, it's great, it's a fun time, and there's some really good stuff in it. But when you get to the continuation starting with Iron Gold, it feels like you've jumped from a base game of ARCS, you've suddenly jumped into a campaign game with 4 different players who have all picked a different fate, and you see them change fates with each book or multiple times in a book, and then you see how all of those things interact with each other. And as you get from Iron Gold onward, the series, in my opinion, that's what takes Red Rising from a fun series to a great series. And it gets a lot more, in my opinion, a lot more mature and a lot more interesting. The world building is more fascinating because you're hearing about Darrow from other characters' point of view. when you get into Iron Gold, something that's really fascinating is that the main character that you've been following for 3 books, you kind of start to see as a villain almost in Iron Gold, which is such a fascinating tactic to take. And Darrow becomes a much more interesting character for it, in my opinion. The action just gets better, the writing gets better, the characters are better, the story gets better, in my opinion. It gets darker, it gets more intense. So yeah, definitely Red Rising gives you all kinds of ARCS vibes. It gives you the base game vibes, it gives you campaign vibes, it gives you that fast-paced feel that ARCS has. It gives you that reactive feel, how everything you do in ARCS, you're just like reacting to everything that everyone else does, and you feel like you're flying by the seat of your pants. That's what reading Red Rising is like the whole way through. And one little thing will like change the entire trajectory of the narrative on a fly. And Red Rising is like that. It has this very unpredictable feel to it. And not in just the sense that, oh, main characters die, but like the story feels like it's constantly changing based on the choices the characters are making. All right, this is, I feel like, kind of an indie darling in the sci-fi community right now that's kind of blew up in the last couple years, because that's when I started seeing it mentioned a lot through a lot of YouTube channels that I watched. And yeah, I kind of picked it up on a whim just because I was in a sci-fi mood after playing ARCS, and I'm kind of in love with it. And that is the Sun Eater series by Christopher Rocchio. So I'm holding up book 2 because I just think this cover is absolutely sick. So the Sun Eater series is a new sci-fi series that I think is going to be concluded next year. It's written by Christopher Rocchio, who's a brand new author, which is absolutely mind-blowing because the writing in these books is next level, honestly. And this is not a spoiler to say because this is revealed in the first page of the first book. The Sun Eater series is about Hadrian Marlowe. He is a character who is writing his own memoir at the end of his life. So the framing device here is that Hadrian has lived this full life and he is in prison, and he is writing the account of his life after everything in the series has happened. And he's the most famous person in the galaxy for a very big reason. Hadrian Marlowe destroyed a planet's sun, and in the process killed over 15 billion lives, I think, both human and alien. And because of that, he is now sentenced and exiled to live out the rest of his days. And basically, Hadrian Marlowe is writing his life story, basically to explain, hey, why did I make the choice that I did? Why did I destroy this planet's sun? Why did I kill 15 billion people? And that is the first page of the book, is you learning this absolutely horrific thing that this character did. And now this guy is writing his story, and he's like, all right, I'm going to tell you why I made this choice, and maybe why I'm going to explain to you why that choice is justified. And so what you're now reading is the story of Hadrian Marlowe from when he was a young adult to hundreds and hundreds of years later when he destroys this sun. It blows my mind that Christopher Rocchio is a new author, because it's so pretentious when I hear people talk about this, but the prose quality is just on another level. You feel so immersed reading a Sun Eater book. Not just immersed because, oh, the writing is good and it describes things well. Immersed in the sense that you feel like Hadrian Marlowe is a real person, and this is exactly how he would write this story. It's not just written well, you feel like it's written well because Hadrian is writing it. And this is how Hadrian would write the story. This is how Hadrian would recount these events. This is how he would remember things. This is what he would prioritize in his story over not prioritizing. The world of Campaign ARCS The Reach feels like a very retro 70s sci-fi kind of world. Not the sleek modern sci-fi that we're kind of used to seeing now. And the Sun Eater series definitely taps into that, right? Kind of like that Dune, that kind of also has that retro sci-fi kind of feel. The Sun Eater is definitely very evocative of that. And so the reason I picked this is because of the world building. And there's a lot of different fates that this is going to remind you of. It's going to remind you of the Imperial fates. It's going to remind you of the Blight, because humanity is fighting this war with this alien race called the Cielsen. And obviously the Planet Breaker fate, I think, is a pretty obvious, I was about to say inspiration, but when you play the Planet Breaker fate, I am now, whenever I think of the Planet Breaker, I think of Hadrian Marlowe because of the Sun Eater series. I feel like that's a pretty obvious comparison to make. When I think of like the epic nature of an ARCS campaign, and I think of the retro sci-fi world building of the ARCS campaign, and I think of what it feels like looking back after you've played through multiple fates in one campaign and seeing what your story is like. When you finish 3 acts of an ARC campaign and you kind of look back and you like piece together your story from beginning to end, that's what reading the Sun Eater feels like. It feels like you're going back and you're writing your memoir and you're figuring out what your story was. And that's what reading the Sun Eater is like. Super cool series. I can't wait to finish it. I am just starting book 4 right now, and I'm excited to see where it goes. So yes, The Sun Eater, big recommendation. We're getting to the final 3 recommendations here, and these books I think are some of my favorites that I'm recommending for sure. I mean, I've liked all of these books that I've recommended, but 2 of these I think are very clear inspirations probably that Cole took when designing the story for ARCS. All right. The first one up is the original Foundation trilogy by Isaac Asimov. The story of Foundation, this is interesting. It starts, there's this massive galactic empire that controls, let's just say, all of the galaxy, because that's easier. All right. Hey, that's pretty cool. We have this ginormous empire that is controlling all of the galaxy. However, there's this character. I struggle to say he's the main character, but he's the character you're going to remember the most, even though he's only basically in the first couple of chapters in this series and then never again. His name is Harry Seldon, and he is a psychohistorian. And psychohistory is this made-up sci-fi concept that basically, using math, you can apply mathematical figures to historical societal movements across history. And what that means is, if you can look back across history and map all of these mass societal changes in history through time, you can actually create a mathematical formula that will predict what is going to happen to society in the future. Because if you have a large enough group of people, then free will and individual choice doesn't matter, because societies at large are very predictable. And so you can use math to predict the future in the sense that you can predict societal movements. I hope I explained that well. It's a lot more eloquent in the book, trust me. And basically, Harry Seldon, using his mathematical formulas in psychohistory, realizes that the Empire is about to begin to deteriorate. The Empire is about to lose its hold on all of the galaxy. It's going to lose its power completely over the course of hundreds and hundreds of years. And eventually, when the Empire falls, there's going to be thousands and thousands of years, millennia of this dark age, where a lot of individual kingdoms are going to sprout out. There's going to be a lot of rebellions. There's going to be a lot of barbarians. There's not going to be peace. There's not going to be unity. When the Empire falls, we're going to go through several, I can't remember how, it's a long dark period. And basically, in order to, and this is inevitable. That's the other thing that's interesting, is this downfall of the Empire is totally inevitable. There's nothing we can do to change the societal movement. However, what Harry Seldon proposes is, hey, what we need to do is establish a foundation on a planet outside of the world. And if we can fill it up with all of the Empire's knowledge and build this giant encyclopedia of knowledge, then we can actually reduce that dark age to only a period of 1,000 years. That is the setup of the book. And what you get for the rest of the Foundation series is you now follow the Foundation, and you follow it through multiple generations of conflict as they hit new obstacles and new crises that they have to overcome in order to shorten this dark period of unrest. And I don't want to spoil what that means or what that looks like, because it's such a cool development. And if you don't know, that's where the book is going. It's such a fun... the Foundation series is such a fun series to explore. Okay, so why is this an ARCS recommendation for me? Okay, firstly, this is written in the 50s, 60s, I believe. So retro sci-fi world. This definitely feels very reminiscent to me of the kinds of things that I experienced while playing ARCS campaign, that kind of retro world building. However, I think it's very obvious that if you play the campaign, the founder fate, the connection's obvious, right? I'm crazy. Cole definitely took the founder fate from Harry Seldon. I'd bet money on it. When he was creating the founder fate, I'm certain that the main inspiration was the Foundation series. Founder, Foundation. I mean, come on. He does all but name Harry Seldon on the fate itself. Now, obviously, the fate, I think, gets into... It's not completely Foundation. I think it's just a starting point and inspiration mode, because the founder fate has a lot to do with fighting the Empire and free cities. And Foundation does kind of get that way a little bit later in the series, but not as much as the founder fate kind of positions it as. However, I think it's very... When I remember the first time I played... it was the first or second campaign I played, I opened the founder fate, and I looked through it. I think it might have been the game I actually played with Cole Worley and Drew Worley. But I looked at it and I went, oh, I'm Harry Seldon from Foundation. And that's what I felt like playing that first act. I felt like I was establishing the Foundation, and it was really cool. But no. So that's why it gives ARCS recommendations, because definitely I think this is clearly an inspiration for, especially that fate, but some of the world building elements. Of course, any, I think, sci-fi book recommendation list, especially when it comes to ARCS, it would be remiss if I did not mention Dune. Maybe the most iconic sci-fi book ever written. Yeah, that sounds about right. So here's my like fancy shelf display copy, and here's like my beat up reading copy. I don't know why I'm holding up both of these. I don't know. We'll hold up the fancy one that looks really nice for the video. So Dune. I mean, what is there to say about Dune that hasn't already been said? It's great. Why does it remind me of ARCS? I feel like that's self-explanatory. I feel like very clearly the art style and a lot of the world building and some of the fates are pulled directly from Dune. The Hegemon fate, the Believer fate, the retro, how many times I've said this? Take a shot every time I say this. Retro sci-fi world building, right? Because it's sci-fi and it's futuristic, but it's very old school because people are run through kingdoms and fiefdoms, and the people don't really use guns. They sword fight and such, right? That, you know, that's Dune. And also I feel like, maybe I'm wrong, but if you look at some of the not original, but some of the old art for Dune from like the 70s and 60s, maybe I'm wrong, but it really feels like some of that art was a huge inspiration for Kyle Farron's art in ARCS. Some of that art is very wacky, very weird, very out there. And so because of that, when you look at a lot of old Dune art, at least I get a lot of the same vibes that I do when I look at the ARCS art. There's a little bit of it that's kind of whimsical and kind of weird, purposefully so. And so yeah, the world building and the art style, kind of both of those I feel like inform each other. And a lot of the fates, like I said, are, you know, you feel like you can pull that from here. But obviously the biggest conceit in Dune is that you got these characters that are fighting over one resource, right? The spice. And I think like one of the core mechanics of ARCS is the idea that people are declaring ambitions, which means we are determining what power looks like, and what we determine by, you know, what kind of resource determines who holds the power in ARCS is very flexible, right? And so ARCS is a game about we're fighting over the resources that we as a Reach have determined means whoever holds the most of this holds the most power. That's obviously, you know, that feels very Dune-like, right? Because the whole point of Dune is that people are fighting over this one planet because it has this one resource type, and whoever holds the most of that resource is going to control the galaxy. And especially in base ARCS, it's very reminiscent of those games where some of those setup cards only create one relic planet or one psionic planet, right? And the whole game is defined by, well, whoever holds that psionic planet is going to have a huge advantage in this game. That's kind of what it feels like. It feels like, wow, that planet is kind of like Arrakis and we're all fighting over it. So there are many ways that Dune reminds me of ARCS. It's also just a good book. Something that is very interesting is that Frank Herbert is obviously very critical of these kinds of leaders and figureheads, cult leaders who take advantage of people through myth and through mythology in order to control society and civilization. And there's a lot of, some really heady concepts that go on in Dune that I think Cole and team tackled pretty well with some of the fates, like the Believer fate and campaign arcs that are really interesting. This is the last recommendation on the list, and it's also my favorite series of all time, both sci-fi and regular. And if you watch my campaign review, you probably know where this is going. As a joke, one of my characters in that review is arguing with the other character about which sci-fi is better, Star Wars or The Expanse. And I think something that I didn't think about when I was making that the joke in the review is that obviously The Expanse is better. So that's my final series recommendation for ARCS Vibes is The Expanse. Any fate that you pick, any element of the ARCS world building that you pick, while it's not retro fantasy sci-fi, this is a more hard sci-fi universe. The Expanse kind of has it all. There's probably, every fate could probably apply to one of the huge cast of characters in this series at some point in the series, right? The Gate Wraiths, the the Admiral, the Steward, the Believer. Yeah, I'm just like thinking about it, like the Caretaker. A lot of these, like when you read The Expanse, you'll get some kind of vibe from some kind of character, some kind of story element as you read through The Expanse. And that's why it's like my final recommendation, because just like every element of ARCS, I'm like, bro, this like reminds me of that thing in the Expanse. And what is the Expanse? So the Expanse, it takes place in our solar system, like 200 years in the future, something like that. And there are three kind of major world powers or factions. There are the inner colonies, and that makes up the two powers of Earth and Mars. So Mars has become an independent world power, and they have seceded from the UN, the United Nations of Earth. And so you've got like kind of the civil war. It starts where there's like kind of this civil war between the Martians and the Earthers, basically. And in between those two are the Belters. And these are people who live out on ships or mining stations or the asteroids that have grown up in low gravity, and they can't actually live on any of the planets because the gravity is too strong. And those are the Belters. And they're like the, they're the worker force, basically. And they're very clearly an oppressed group of people. They're oppressed by both groups of inners, both the Martians and the Earthers. And when you start into the Expanse, you're in the middle of this kind of simmering, almost Cold War conflict between Earth and Mars, and between them is this oppressed people of the Belt. And a massive world-changing event happens that is going to ignite the conflict between all three of these factions and completely change the world and the story and the trajectory of these people forever. And so there's the series is epic in scope because you're following, an entire galaxy of characters and people and factions and world powers. But it's also very intimate because you're following a main crew of people on this ship called the Rocinante. And that's why one of the things I love about The Expanse is that, much like ARCS, it is both epic in scale and small in scale. It is both huge and intimate because there's all these massive world-changing events that are going on, but also you're so invested in the individual characters and how they react to those changes or what's going to happen to them through the story. And that's something that I said in my reviews about ARCS, is how when you take both the base game and the campaign game together, something that I love about ARCS, especially the campaign, is it's so huge in scope because, hey, we've got these full characters, we're all changing the world, every act, there's some massive world-changing event, the story is changing, where our choices are changing the other fates, they're changing the court deck, and there's all these big things going on, but what you remember is the individual characters that you play out through the fate. You remember, man, I was that admiral turned pirate turned gate wraith, like how cool is that, and how that happened. And the other players are like, yeah, I was this character, I was the steward turned pathfinder. And, your big world-changing event, like, shaped me. And what you come away with is not just the giant epic galaxy-spanning story, you come away from a campaign of ARCS with these little individual vignettes of these characters. And that's what reading The Expanse feels like. So The Expanse, the book series, is what I consider a trilogy of trilogies. So there's 9 books total in the series, starting with the first one, Leviathan Wakes. Each individual trilogy feels like it's its own 3-act campaign of ARCS, right? With like an act change in between each book. But then in the grand scheme of the series, each new trilogy also feels like a massive shift in narrative and story, like a campaign ARCS. So you've almost reading The Expanse feels like a trilogy of ARCS campaigns. So like you've played 3 ARCS campaigns, and that's what reading The Expanse feels like. That's like how big and epic it feels. There are some giant, major changes to the world and the characters that are irrevocable throughout the series, and I don't want to spoil them, but there are some like world-shattering events that take place that blow your mind, and the series is never the same after that. The story, what I love about James S.A. Corey is that they commit to the bit. They don't do some massive world-changing event and then kind of like, we'll do like a soft reset and roll it back. No, like every single choice that a character makes and every single world-changing event is taken to its logical extreme and its logical conclusion. And what that means is that the story by the end of The Expanse and the world by the end of The Expanse by the 9th book is so radically different from the world and the story in the first book of The Expanse. There's true change in The Expanse. There's true endings and finales to The Expanse. The characters are more well realized. The story is more interesting. And I think ultimately it's a complete story. It begins, it has a middle, and it has an end. and both the story and all the characters reach a logical conclusion. It's satisfying, and that's it. And the authors have said they're not coming back to this world. This is the story. You know, even though it's a big franchise, we're not just going to keep these characters around. We're not just going to keep bringing them back. And that's kind of the thing that really shifted me from Star Wars in the last couple years. Even though there's been some good stuff with Star Wars recently, The Expanse really showed me how much better something could be if it's not a long-running series that can never change. That's why I kind of directly pitted in the reviews The Expanse against Star Wars, because it was kind of a battle that I had with myself. And, you know, I still like both. So it's like, who cares, right? And strangely enough, it's funny that I'm putting this in my list with where I recommend books that have ARCS vibes, because one of the reasons I found The Expanse is I was looking, this is so funny, I was looking for shows or books with Twilight Imperium vibes. Like, I love the massive epic political nature of Twilight Imperium, and I was like, I want that in a sci-fi series. And then I found The Expanse, and I was like, bro, it's like I'm watching a season of Twilight Imperium, the TV show. So yeah, it's funny that The Expanse I'm putting in here that also gives me ARCS vibes gave me huge Twilight Imperium vibes, because that's actually how I came onto The Expanse. So yeah, this video's gone long enough. These are my recommendations. If you take away one thing from this video, it is watch and read The Expanse. Those are my book recommendations for if you are looking for something that gives you ARCS vibes. I hope this has been a fun video. This is not normally something I've done before. I'm looking at the timestamp, and wow, this has gone way longer than I thought it would, so this is not going to be fun to edit, but hey, you know, whatever. I hope that you guys enjoy some of these books that I've recommended. If you disagree with me, or if you have new additions, new recommendations that I didn't include in this list, bro, please drop them in the comment section. I'm always looking for more sci-fi stuff to read and to watch. So yeah, if any of you guys see this and you go, oh man, he didn't mention this series, please throw it down in there, and I'll check them out. I'll probably read them. That's enough for today, guys. Until next time, see ya.